Welcome to the Argus Crude Report, the TMX series, a podcast dedicated to Canadian heavy crude flows now hitting Pacific markets. In this series, we'll delve into the newly commenced Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, or TMX, its evolution, and the impact of the pipeline's operation on global markets. My name is Gus Vasquez, and I'm the editorial manager for Crude and LPG here at Argus, and I am joined today by our TMX reporter, Rachel McGuire. Last time we did one of these a few weeks back, we were talking about pricing for TMX barrels and how we saw the relationship between prices at Vancouver versus the same grades out of the US Gulf Coast, because that was kind of an interesting dynamic that was going on then. Since we launched our new prices on Tuesday, what else have we seen? What are the patterns that you're spotting right now?
So for a little bit, prices at the U.S. Gulf Coast for Canadian crude were fluctuating quite a bit. So they were on quite a downward trend due to two refineries in the mid-continent being out. Those refineries have since come back online. So you're starting to see prices rise for the same grades out of the U.S. West Coast or the U.S. Gulf Coast. If you turn to look at the U.S. West Coast, prices had been falling pretty steadily relative to the U.S. Gulf Coast. And then at the start of the trade month, on the first day that we launched prices, we heard some offers that lifted the prices quite a bit. But then on Wednesday, prices fell after we heard some offers fall by about $1.50. So prices have since fallen. So we'll see how the month takes us. I'm expecting to see prices stay towards the downward trend.
Again, I think that is something that people are going to be looking at going forward, is that spread between Vancouver and Gulf Coast, because that will influence decisions that are being made, I suppose. So that's the Gulf Coast and Vancouver. What about Vancouver and the West Coast? What are we seeing there?
So TMX crude at the U.S. West Coast is displacing Latin American crude, which was expected. That's what we were expecting to see. So right now, it looks like in the first 3 months since the pipeline came online, Latin American crude has been displaced quite a bit. So about 19% fewer Latin American imports came into the U.S. West Coast, and that is due to TMX coming online. The biggest impact was on the Ecuadorian grade Napo. That decreased quite a bit because it's very similar to the heavy sour crude you see from TMX. But not only are the heavy sours being impacted, lighter sweets like Argentinian Medanito are also being displaced out of the region. So it's quite interesting to see the overall impact of TMX on similar quality crudes and then different crudes. And I'm expecting that pattern to continue due to the U.S. West Coast proximity to Vancouver. It's a lot closer and a shorter voyage.
Indeed, yeah. And it's interesting that it's affecting different qualities too, because I think a lot of people think of TMX as the heavy sour Canadian grades, but there are lighter Canadian grades coming through those pipes too now with Syncrude and MSW that I know we talked about last time. So that is interesting. So again, I guess keeping with a regional theme, we've talked about the Gulf Coast, now we've talked about the West Coast and how that's affecting Latin America. That's all on our side of the equation, right? On the America side. But we know that TMX is having impacts globally. Clearly, it goes into Asia in quite big volumes, to the point that not only did we launch FOB prices at Vancouver at the start of this week, but we, at the same time, launched delivered prices into Shandong and China, because that has become quite an active market. So what is the global impact so far that we are seeing?
Yeah, so we are actually seeing some Alaskan North Slope cargoes head into China, and this is not something that happens very often. So right now, two Suezmaxes are on their way to China with ANS. The last time the two Suezmaxes in the same month went to China was in April of 2021, so this is quite the occurrence. And so some market participants are concerned that TMX crude will displace ANS crude at the U.S. West Coast, and those barrels heading to China could be an indicator that, yes, this is currently happening. Another big sort of disruption that's happening right now is that Brunei is taking its first TMX cargo. And that'll be really interesting to see if they continue that pattern of taking TMX cargoes. Usually the country tends to import things on the lighter, sweeter side. So it'll be interesting to see if they change their slate towards the heavier sour crudes like TMX.
That is definitely interesting. And again, this idea of the lighter Canadian grades having an impact is pretty interesting to me, and I'm sure to lots of people who are listening right now. I guess the only thing that I have in mind too is kind of goes in line with expectations. With as you've mentioned, a lot of what is happening is not really a surprise to most people. I think things are happening in the way that most people thought they would. The last part of that, I guess, is PAL, the Pacific Area Lightering. I think, when we talk about volumes going to Asia, we are again seeing what we expected to see, which is you're having a lot of those Aframaxes from Vancouver come down to that lightering area and then doing ship-to-ship transfers into the VLCCs. And then those VLCCs are the ones that are going over to Asia, which makes sense, right? Because economies of scale for one thing, but also even in terms of freight rate, I talked to some people who say it's about $1 more in freight to take an Aframax directly from Vancouver into Asia than it is if you take a VLCC from the coast of California into Asia. So there's obviously some economics that come into play, and that's going to affect how people do their logistics. But yeah, I guess in a way it's good to know that nothing is really surprised anyone so far. Although I do find the ANS very interesting because I think not everybody thought that would happen, and certainly not this quickly, maybe. But yes, that's great, and that's really good information. I think it's quite a lot of information, and unless I'm mistaken, Rachel, that brings us pretty much right up to speed on everything that we've heard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, in that case, I think this is probably a good place to finish our podcast for today. And with that, I would like to thank you, Rachel, for the information. That was very helpful. And I'd like to thank our listeners. For our listeners, if they would like to know more about Argus's view on TMX, we will be releasing another podcast probably in a few weeks, so keep an eye out for that. If you are looking for more in-depth daily coverage of what's going on in the Americas crude oil markets, generally speaking, subscribing to Argus Crude is probably your best bet. You will gain access to daily price information for the crude assessments globally, including pipeline assessments like WTI at Houston. Plus, you'll get exclusive insights on TMX because we do write about that pretty much every day these days. So don't miss out on this valuable resource. Thanks again for tuning in, and we look forward to having you with us on the next episode of the Crude Report TMX series.